Greetings, psychology students. Welcome in for another audio video lecture here. I am Professor Zeeb, and this time I'm going to teach you about language. So the goal of this little lecture here is to kind of demonstrate how special language is for humans. In other words, why we have it so great when we use language. And to do that, we're going to compare it to some of our closest relatives, or more specifically primates, to kind of show you how they use language and how it's very different for humans, okay? So let's go right to our slides here. We'll open up our presentation. Okay, so let's take a look here. And we're going to peruse the topic of human language, okay? So once again, language in humans is obviously a very special thing. We do some things that, quite frankly, no other species will do, according to psychologists and our evidence and so forth. So let's take a look here. We're going to talk about productivity in human language, okay? So once again, what's really interesting about human language and the way we use human language is that we have this ability to combine words into sentences that express literally an unlimited variety of ideas, and this was brought forth by Deacon in 1997. In other words, as humans, we're very flexible with using language. It's not a very specific thing and narrowed down to certain things. We're able to express an unlimited variety of ideas and to do it in a very flexible way at the same time. So one of the ways we would sort of explain this, and by the way, it's a lot of psychologists and experts argue that humans are the only one that can actually do this, okay? So once again, human language shows these particular characteristics where we're literally inventing new sentences every day that, quite frankly, no one has ever heard. I mean, theoretically, you could argue that I may express something that has never been expressed completely in that way. I mean, certainly it could have been, how would you ever know? But the point is we have that ability. One of the ways that we can do that, once again, limited to humans, one of the ways that we can actually do that is through this concept called transformational grammar. This was brought about by the famous linguist Noam Chomsky in 1980. And he describes it as thus: a system for converting what he called a deep structure into a surface structure. So theoretically, humans are the only ones that are able to do this. And we can really do it in a seamless way. In fact, we probably take it for granted every time we're communicating and we're saying things and so forth and using language, okay? Let's define what this means, because obviously this needs some explanation here. What a deep structure is the underlying logic or meaning of a sentence. In other words, it's what you desire to say. It's what you're sort of thinking as you're transforming it into words or a blog, for example. So it's the underlying meaning of what you're actually trying to communicate, where a surface structure is what is actually spoken or written. In other words, what your mouth actually says, what you write down on a piece of paper or type into a computer, for example. So once again, a deep structure is kind of what you mean to say, where a surface structure is what you actually say. Now remember, Chomsky and some of our experts believe that what sets humans apart from other species and so forth is we're able to transform these things. We're able to do this. In other words, we're able to transform a deep structure into a surface structure in an unlimited variety of ways. Let me kind of show you what I mean. Let's say that this person here that you see desires an apple, okay? So what we're saying here is that the deep structure is I desire an apple, I want an apple. Now notice this person can communicate that desire in several different ways. I want an apple, I'd like an apple, give me an apple, may I have an apple, and so on and so on. So in other words, as humans, theoretically what sets us apart from other related species is that we're able to take this deep structure and to communicate it into a surface structure in many different ways. In other words, we can sort of express the same idea in multiple ways and flexible ways. So once again, that's what makes human language so special. Let's kind of take a look at this next slide, okay? And just to kind of show you what I mean, where sometimes we're going to find that a surface structure can have two deep structures. I always like this example that the book gives here. So let's say that someone comes up to you and they say, hey, never threaten someone with a chainsaw. Okay, so that is what the surface structure is. That's basically what is being spoken to you or what you heard. Now notice that this could mean a couple different things, okay? Deep structure number one here on the left, you are holding a chainsaw, don't threaten to use it to attack someone. So never try to attack someone with a chainsaw. So in other words, that's the deep structure or the meaning of that particular sentence. Now notice on the right here that it could mean something completely different if someone said that to you. In other words, never threaten someone with a chainsaw could also mean that some deranged, crazy person is holding a chainsaw. You probably shouldn't threaten them or you would face the consequences of doing so. Do you guys kind of see what I mean by that and what the author means of our textbook? In other words, sometimes a surface structure of a sentence could have two deep structures or possibly even more. So once again, that really speaks to the flexibility and the special properties of human language, where we're finding that's very unique to humans, and some people argue that other species cannot do that. So once again, to wrap that part up, humans use productivity in language through the use of transformational grammar. In other words, the way we transform a surface structure into a deep structure, which makes our use of language very unique. Okay, so now to further develop the point here, we're going to look at some of our closest relatives and understand how they use language and their limitations as well, to further sort of demonstrate how great human language actually is. So we go to that section in the book there, non-human precursors to language. So we're going to look at some of our closest relatives and species, more specifically chimpanzees, okay, who share a lot of DNA with humans. In fact, I've heard estimates from 98 to 99% of our DNA is similar to chimpanzees. So the point is that they're very close to us in many ways. And we also have evidence that to a certain extent they use language, but in a very different way. All right, so let's talk about chimpanzees. Believe it or not, starting around the 1920s, psychologists and researchers actually attempted to teach chimpanzees how to speak. In other words, they wanted to see how far they could go with language. Can they actually say words? Can they actually communicate as a human would? What is their limitations of language, basically? Well, they found that due to their poorly developed vocal cords, obviously it's not the same as in humans, that those first attempts were unsuccessful. In other words, maybe they got on the sort of verge of success, but were never completely successful in terms of actually uttering sentences and so forth and uttering language, okay? So in other words, it is very limited. Research also shows that chimps, you can use symbols for requests rather than descriptions. In other words, they can learn sign language and other means of communicating. Maybe they can actually say words, but they can use gestures to sort of communicate needs, for example. So research found that they can use those gestures for requests, however, not possibly just for description. In other words, they can use it to actually request things, I guess is the point there. All right, so I want to kind of continue with that. They also found some limitations in that what they found in the research is that chimpanzees could rarely use these requests in original combinations. In other words, it was very limited in creating unique ways of communicating ideas, as we said before with humans. So in other words, it was very limited in that sense. But at the same time, it's very impressive to show that they can actually use symbols to communicate, but unfortunately, there are some limitations as we've just mentioned. Okay, so we're gonna go to one of the most famous cases of this, Some of you may have heard of this particular chimpanzee, Washoe, very famous chimpanzee. Get this, guys. So researchers were working with Washoe, and they found that she could learn 100 symbols, over 100 symbols using American Sign Language. So they actually taught her American Sign Language to communicate, and they found 100 different symbols, which is, wow, very impressive. They also found that she could answer questions involving things like where, or what, or even who. What I mean by that is that if we asked Washoe through sign language, you know, who did this or who is this, she would often respond with a person. So she could correctly identify that that is asking about a person. She may not have gotten the person correct in every case, but she would answer as if it was a person. So in other words, by asking where, what, or who, she would respond appropriately, even though it may not have been the actual correct answer. So that's impressive. That's showing that Washoe could understand the nature of the question, but may not be completely correct in those responses, okay? All right, so even though Washoe is a very impressive case, there are some limitations, as we said before. However, we're going to take it to the next step now, and we're going to go to a different species. And these are one of my favorite primates of all time. These are the bonobos, also known as the pygmy chimps, which are some of our most impressive examples of a non-human species using language. So guys, I'm going to recommend, if you ever go to the San Diego Zoo, they have this awesome exhibit of the bonobos. Please take the effort to go see these guys, because they're very entertaining and just, wow, just amazing animals. And this is going to sort of demonstrate why, okay? So if you go to a zoo, make sure, and they have this exhibit, make sure you check these guys out. They are worth the time to do that, okay? So bonobos, which some people know them as pygmy chimps, obviously, because they're a little bit smaller than our typical chimpanzee, actually show some amazing human similarities in many different ways. So in other words, they're very intelligent. They can do things beyond what a typical chimpanzee can do. It's just impressive. So for example, research has found that they can form attachments just like a person can. So they form attachments to people. They found that the females of the species are sexually responsive even when they're not fertile. So a lot of times you see that limited in the animal kingdom. So not so much with the bonobo. So that's kind of an interesting point there. They found that the males help to raise the infants. So it's almost like a family thing where dad is involved in raising the young, which we don't always see in different species, okay? They also found that they share. They like to share their resources with each other. So, wow, a lot of just amazing human similarities in many different ways. But we're going to kind of focus more on language in this next section here with bonobos, okay? So once again, some pretty amazing stuff here. They found that bonobos can describe objects that they are not requesting. So they found that with chimpanzees, a lot of times they would use language to describe something that they want. Bonobos, on the other hand, can describe objects that they're not actually requesting. So they can use symbols to do that. They can name or use symbols to basically describe something that they don't necessarily want. So that shows an impressive use of language there. They found that bonobos have the ability to describe past events. So they understand the past, using memory to describe things. But wow, absolutely amazing. They also found that they can make original requests. In other words, they can request something that they've never heard or do it in a completely unique way to a certain extent. So once again, we see a lot of just amazing abilities with the bonobos. Just to kind of put that in perspective, that would be similar to our typical 2.5-year-old. So in other words, we would expect a 2.5-year-old child to be able to do some of those things that we just mentioned. So wow, that's pretty impressive. It shows that they're very intelligent and they're using language in a very special way, for example. They also found that bonobos can follow odd commands. In other words, through sign language, if we ask them to do something that doesn't really make sense, in other words, it's not necessarily surrounding common sense or food, for example, they will actually follow those commands. So some examples of this would be researchers requested or commanded, I should say, the bonobo to bite your ball, and they did so. So in other words, they understand what that means, even though there may not be an exact reason for that. Or another example would be take the vacuum outside, which they actually followed, and they followed that command. So once again, it shows that may possibly that their language use and understanding is a little bit beyond a typical chimpanzee, but certainly nothing quite to how humans use language. So once again, as we wrap up the lecture here, it shows that as humans, we are very special. We have a very special use of language. It really sets us apart from many other species. And so once again, something that we take for granted, maybe we should not, because it's a pretty unique, special thing, as we've said several times during the lecture. All right, so hopefully you guys have found this interesting. Make sure you read that section in the book, and we will see you online.